All right, welcome to Chapter 10. We've got 4 more to go after this. We're going to be talking tonight about, or today, about probation, parole, and intermediate sanctions. And one of the frequent questions I get when I teach this lecture is, why are we spending time on probation and parole? Why aren't we focusing on prisons and jails? And the answer, quite simply, is that the bulk, or the most common sentence after a conviction, is not a long-term incarceration. It is a probationary period. And if you yourself think about if you've ever had a speeding ticket or a traffic ticket, or you've ever come in contact with the criminal justice system, the most common thing to happen for you was an intermediate sanction. You probably paid a fine. So this is something that we should look at just because of the sheer frequency inside the system. Okay, so if we look at some of the quick numbers here, and this should help us, today there's about 3.8 million offenders who are serving their sentences on probation rather than actually in prison or jail. Then we can add another 850,000 who have been paroled. They've served some part of their time, typically in prison, sometimes in jail, but typically in prison. And I'll distinguish jail from prison a little bit here. Probation and parole collectively go by the current term of community corrections. And this is often considered less severe than prison. So I said I'd make a distinction between prison and jail. So the way, as a student, you should keep this in your mind is to think that for minor crimes, typically a misdemeanor, in most cases you will serve your time in a jail. And in North Carolina, these are going to be run on a county basis by the sheriff. If you are convicted of a more serious crime, you will probably go to a prison, and this most of the time is for a felony, and the felonies are run by the states. So jails are run by county for minor crimes, prisons run by the state, more serious crimes. Parole and probation, obviously, since they arise from both potential incarceration in jail and potential incarceration in prison, depending on the jurisdiction we're talking about, certainly are within a framework established by every state. As to exactly who's monitoring them, typically those are going to be state offenders and officers. Okay, why do we practice community corrections, probation, parole? Well, here again, much like the last lecture where we talked about theories as to why we punish, here are theories as to why we have community corrections. And the first one to talk about is reintegration. One of the things I tell students and people I talk to about the criminal justice system, particularly those that believe in a very harsh system, lock them up, throw away the key, is that we never throw away the key. That almost everybody who goes into prison is going to get out someday. And the question is, how do you want them to be when they get out? Don't you want someone who is going to be ready not to commit future crimes, who's going to be prepared to obey the law? So reintegration, preparing people to return to the community and not be a threat to that community. Second one is diversion. There's people we recognize that have been caught up in the system that we feel don't really deserve prison or jail. And the most common example of this would be the very young, and in some cases the very old, but certainly the very young. The third thing, and this is more, I guess you could classify it as a bureaucratic ideal, is community corrections is remarkably cheap when we compare it to prison or jail. And when we get to prisons or jail in the next few chapters, we'll talk about incarceration costs can be $10,000 or $20,000 a year or $30,000 a year. If you're treating supermax, it can be $40,000 a year. And You can do a probation or parole, community corrections, at a fraction of that cost. And we'll look at some numbers in this presentation, this lecture. Okay. So probation is the most common form of punishment in the United States. It is by far what we see. The legal status of the convicted offender who serves his sentence is subject to conditions imposed by the court. And I would have people I represented convicted of crimes. So let's suppose I had been representing a drunk driver. It was very common that there were conditions imposed upon him or her when she was released. Specific for drunk driving, it would be that they have a restricted driver's license, what we typically call a Cinderella license, a license that would let people go to and from work, would let them drive during the day to go to grocery stores, but they couldn't drive at night to go to bars. Also, theoretically, we can treat people caught up in the system more economically, more humanely, because I don't think anybody would say that even the nicest prisons are good places, and that hopefully what exists on the outside is surely better than what exists on the inside. Okay, so this pie chart here, you can see that most of the people that wind up being convicted of a crime are going to serve time under probation. They're never going to prison. And let's distinguish probation and parole here. We're going to do that later, but I think to read this chart fairly, just take this quick definition. Probation, you never go to jail, ever. You haven't gone to jail or prison. We're going to set you out and we're going to keep an eye on you. Parole, on the other hand, you went to jail, you went to prison, and you served at least some of your time, and now you're out. In both probation and parole, you can wind up going to prison in the first place. That would be probation if you violated it. For parole, you'd wind up going back to prison. Now, like a lot of criminal justice terms, people, including myself, will sometimes use probation and parole interchangeably. It has a specific definition, but it's one of those words that has entered the English vocabulary in a common sense, and people will use it imprecisely, much like the next two terms here, prison and jail. People use those terms as if they're identical things, and they certainly are. They both describe an incarceration, but prisons, as we just talked about, holding people for felonies, are different than jails holding people for misdemeanors. Okay, so the majority of people convicted of a crime don't go to prison, don't go to jail. They are put on probation. Even if they go to prison or jail, they're far more likely to end their time, at least from the prison in particular, on parole. Okay, in traditional probation, you agree to certain terms for a specified amount of time in return for being let out. Your benefit is you're not going to be in prison, and the length of time you're on probation is probably not going to be as long as the length of time you could have gone to prison for. This is very beneficial for you in most cases. The state, of course, benefits financially. We'll talk more about that when we see some statistics, but a suspended sentence, you'll sometimes see the term used where the offender is sentenced after being convicted but is not required to begin serving the sentence. So you get your time and it is suspended. Then sometimes you'll hear a description, alternative sentencing arrangements, split sentences, where we have a shock probationary period or a shock incarceration period or intermittent incarceration. So let me back up and talk about a little bit about the theory about this. We've been studying incarceration for a long time. We know that the positive benefits of it, what people learn, how they fear it, most of that is what we would say is front-loaded. Most people experience that. So to put this in a practical example, most people will go to prison, and when they get in immediately, they'll be so shocked with the conditions, assuming this is their first time, that they will say to themselves, well, I'm never going back. I'm going to do my time. I'm getting out of here, and I'm never going to go back. And then what's going to happen over a period of time is they are going to be socialized, or it's called prisonization, but they're going to be socialized, they're going to be transformed in many ways from a civilian into a convict. And that positive desire to change is going to fade. So when we talk about alternative sentencing, shock incarceration, we can try to give them that shock, let them out, and say, all right, you don't want to go back. You've come to that realization before they go through the further process of prisonization, where they simply adapt, because people can adapt to the most horrible circumstances. Okay, who doesn't get probation? Well, multiple convictions. If you were convicted of murder, if you kidnapped someone, you raped them, and you murdered them, the idea that you would get released on probation is pretty far-fetched. Another reason we wouldn't give you probation: did you commit your crime while you were already on probation? Because that's going to show that you're still a danger to the community, and that's one of the things we're focusing on. Do you have multiple past convictions? Do we now believe that you are essentially a bad sinner? You're never going to be a productive member of society. What's the point of giving you probation again? You're just going to violate it. Now the next one's a little curious. Are you addicted to narcotics? There's a kind of unscientific belief that people that are addicted to narcotics are somehow weak-willed. That if they really didn't want to be addicted, they wouldn't be. That it is a choice to be an addict to narcotics. And like many things, there's a grain of truth in that, certainly. But most people who are addicted have a physical addiction. And to break that addiction can be exceedingly difficult. So saying that you're an addict, therefore that shows you have a weak will, therefore that shows you wouldn't function well in society, perhaps not the best thing. And don't forget, prisons are not detox centers. Prisons and jails are not designed to take people that are addicted to drugs and wean them off in a competent medical model. Another reason would be you wouldn't get probation if you seriously injured someone. And a further one would be you used a weapon. So for example, let's take North Carolina again, because I like to try to focus on North Carolina. North Carolina has what's called the 60-month sentencing enhancement. If you use a firearm in the commission of a set number of crimes, not important exactly which ones, we can add additional time in prison to that. So it is worse, for example, to rob a house with a gun than without a gun. It's worse to steal money from someone's person with a gun or without a gun. Okay, so a robbery becomes more serious with the presence of a weapon. The probation officer and the judge impose conditions. So one of the most common conditions I would see with my clients if someone was convicted, and most people who go to trial are going to be convicted, would be things like you have to maintain employment, you have to maintain a residence, you have to submit sometimes to searches without warrant, you have to report to day reporting centers, you have to cooperate with the probation or parole officer, you have to take drug tests or alcohol tests, and you're going to have general conditions that pretty much everybody have: employment, residency, and then you'll have specific ones that can be linked to your crime. So if you were a drug user, we might say, okay, well, we're going to make a specific condition of your probation that you undergo drug testing to make sure that you haven't lapsed. The judge has a lot of power here to kind of tailor-make the probationary terms. There's generic ones that almost everybody sees, but the judge, depending upon what he's like and who he's dealing with, could really structure this. So again, for a quick example, we used to have a judge in Wake County, His name was Jerry Leonard. He was a very good judge. And he did a lot of juvenile cases. So because he had a lot of juveniles, he would very often, his philosophy was very pro-education. So he said, one of your problems is, the reason you got in trouble, and sometimes you'd have clients that got in trouble committing assaults, is that you didn't finish high school. You have a dead-end job, you're frustrated. Great, I understand that. One of the conditions of your probation is that you're going to get your GED. You're going to get some education. And I've seen or read about judges that make people read books, or make people attend meditation, or make people try to adjust things in their lives. So the judge's individual philosophy can play a big role here. Okay, so your standard conditions are imposed on everybody. You report, you notify them of change. Then there can be more punitive ones. Now these are things like fines, community service, and drug testing. I talked about a couple of those, but let's talk a little bit about fines. Americans don't like to pay taxes, and it's very difficult for a politician to pay tax, to tell taxpayers they have to have an increased payment. But you can try to get money from people that can't complain about it, and one of those groups of people are going to be people convicted of crimes. If you can tell them you're going to pay a fine or court costs, nobody is going to feel a lot of sympathy for them. They're not going to be able to join a taxpayer strike, or people are not going to get upset. So if you looked at the court fees in many jurisdictions, these can be significant components of the tax base. And this can mean that communities can become very reliant upon catching people, convicting people, and getting money out of them for things like training law enforcement or regularly running emergency services. You see fees inside even North Carolina, court costs, things like retirement for corrections officers and things like that. There can be a tremendous number of things in there. Treatment conditions are common. Drug and alcohol counseling, alcohol abuse, mental health issues, all of those can be conditions. You might have, I've had clients that suffered from schizophrenia, and you would see conditions of that you have to stay on medication, that you have to stay under the care of a doctor, that very common condition. Now, the person watching over this, after the judge sets the conditions, is the probation officer, and he's kind of straddling between two worlds. The first thing he often does, and different jurisdictions do this differently, but usually a probation officer will provide a judge with a PSI, a pre-sentence investigation report. And this PSI says, okay, this is what this guy's problems is, this is what this guy's resources is, judge, have at it. After that, the next major thing that the probation officer does is he is a supervisor. He watches a number of people. Now, sometimes in small jurisdictions, the same person might do two jobs, but in most large jurisdictions, they're going to separate them out. There can be some conflicting goals here for a probation officer. A probation officer wants to protect the community, but he also wants his guys to succeed. If he should have he should have bought into the people he's supervising. He should have tried to help them achieve a successful term. And so that can be in conflict with, well, do I violate him? Do I bring him out of the general community and return him to prison? So you notice this discussion question, I thought it was pretty interesting. Usually I don't talk too much about these, but in Rutherford County, Tennessee, probation violators pay $60 a day in fees to cover their incarceration. If they can't pay that, he can face additional times. And one of the things that has been set up is a pay-to-play system. The more money you have, the different the outcome becomes for you. And to be honest, I've had clients who had such high probationary fees or fines that the only way that they could pay those back and avoid prison was to often commit future crimes, usually drug dealing. So you'll have, for example, in some states, yes, you have a right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, you get one appointed. You might be found not guilty, but that jurisdiction said, well, we gave you an attorney, so here's your bill. And a guy might say, well, but I was innocent. They said, yeah, but that has nothing to do with that. Pay us the money. If you can't, guess what? You can wind up going to jail. There is another problem, and this is kind of endemic in all government organizations, is that we frequently go to people inside local, state, national government, and we'll say, do more with less. We know that there's an ideal caseload. Maybe you should have, let's pick a number for a corrections officer. Let's suppose that you should have 20 people you're watching. And let's suppose on average that there are 20 work days in a week. That means you can spend in a month, assuming you do no other paperwork, you can spend 8 hours on that individual. And you may not spend it all in one day, but you might say, okay, I'm going to go check to see if he's still working. And you drive to his place of employment and you ask, I'm going to make sure that he's still where he told me he's living. I'm going to drive there. I'm going to make sure he's still seeing his counselor. I'm going to go talk to him. I'm going to see how he's doing in his classes. I'm going to go talk to his professors or whatever. So you can be much more intensive. But what happens is the state legislature and the whole system wants to do this as cheap as possible. So they won't give a corrections officer 20 people to watch. They might give him 300 people to watch or 200 people to watch. Well, now as opposed to having 8 hours to watch someone, right? You might only have an hour a month to track someone. And that means that mostly what you're doing is checking off boxes. You'll call up, hey, is Joe still working? Yes, great, check, he's still employed. Hey, is Peter still in treatment? Yes, he is, great, check. You don't get a chance to say, well, how's he doing? What's his prognosis? How's he doing at work? Any anger issues? Anything you need to tell me? You can't establish a relationship, in other words. So probation can end in one of two ways. Most commonly, they finish their probationary sentence. You got 6 months probation, 6 months goes by, you're free and clear. The other way is the probationary or parolee can misbehave and the probation is revoked. Now this can happen if they commit a new crime or if they fail one of their conditions. So, for example, you might have a condition that says you have to be employed and you lose your job and you can't get another one. You might have a condition that says you can't test positive for alcohol and you blow a .10. So that is a violation. At this point, the probation officer has some discretion. Is he going to refer the violation to the courts? Is he going to start the process of revoking this guy's probation? And I say guy. Obviously, this can be women as well. But remember, men are vastly overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Okay, so in the past, the revocation process was much less formal. And gradually, there were some limits put in, mainly by the courts imposing these. You don't get the same constitutional protections you get at all time that you would get in a regular court, but you get some. So you are going to get a preliminary hearing. Is there probable cause to determine, yeah, we need to revoke your probation? And usually that's going to be enough to bring someone in and hold them for a while. Then in front of a judge, the probationary agency, usually the officer, is going to present the evidence that says, here's the violation, here's the failed drug test, here's the fact that he was arrested for something else. Then the judge has to decide, is this enough to say, okay, he's been bad enough that we are going to revoke his time out in the world. So does probation work? That's a really interesting question. Probation and other forms of community correction can be evaluated in a lot of ways. You could, for example, evaluate it just skipping all this. Is it cheap? And the answer would be yes. Does it allow us to bring more people inside the criminal justice system? It sure does. Do we know the best way to do this? We do. Small caseloads, more effective. Not that we do it. So what are the risks? And we're going to introduce a term here, recidivism. That's the likelihood that you wind up back inside the criminal justice system, typically rearrested or incarcerated. And we look at things like, we're going to go from the bottom up, unemployment and substance abuse. If someone can't get a job or has an addiction problem, that is a serious roadblock to them completing probation. And think about this, though. Think about an unintended consequence. If you say your condition of release is employment, all right. Think about rural North Carolina. Not a lot of jobs in rural North Carolina. So if there is a job there, you're going to have to take any job you can. If there isn't a job there, you're going to have to say to your probation officer, there's no jobs. Can I move to an area like Raleigh, Durham, or if you're in Florida, Orlando, or if you're in Texas, Austin, where there is more job and more opportunity. So you actually may be feeding criminals into urban areas from rural areas as part of your conditions. Is there social support for crime? I mean, are you, an extreme example, but it's one way to think about it, is, are you associating with people that are habitual criminals? Do you have pro-criminal attitudes? I had a client once, I'll call him John Doe, and John loved to fight. He thought it was the best day in the world if he could get into a fight with somebody. The result of which is he had a lot of convictions for assault. John would never steal a dime from you. He was rigorously honest when it came to that. But he was violent, so he had this attitude that fighting was good. And maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago in a more violent society, this would have been tolerated and maybe not that big a deal. But 21st century America, violent people will often run afoul of the system. Okay, the last one, antisocial personality patterns. Now this comes awful close to antisocial personality disorder. That's sociopathic behavior in the old terminology. We know that somewhere over 1% of the population exhibits significant levels of antisocial personality behavior. So I'm just going to take a moment here in this lecture to talk just a tad about this. I'm going to have to simplify this because I only have 4 or 5 minutes to do it. But basically, an antisocial personality disorder at the extreme has never developed a sense of empathy, has never developed the idea that you are a person. So if they have to do things that harms you but benefits them, they don't engage in the sort of same, what could be called the hedonistic calculus, the same sort of calculation. Well, I could do that, but it's going to hurt this person, like most of us will, right? You wouldn't push over a little kid to take his lollipop because that'd be cruel. But someone that has an antisocial personality pattern, or antisocial personality disorder, wouldn't hesitate to steal the lollipop from the kid. And that's just a very mild example. So that can really be a risk of recidivism. Okay, now parole means that you are being let out of prison typically before your sentence is expired. So unlike probation where you never went, parole, you go to prison, we let you out. It's based on the concept of grace, mercy one could say, consent, and custody. Now both probation and parole operate under the assumption that it's better that this person serve his time in the community than in prison or jail. In probation, you get a conviction, but you don't go to prison or jail. In parole, you have already served some time in the correctional facility. So you've already gone to jail, you've already gone to prison. That's the fundamental difference between the two. So conditions of parole are very similar to probation conditions. Do you have a job? Do you have a residence? Let's suppose you were accused of assault on your wife, domestic violence. One of the conditions, of course, might be that you can't come within a set distance of your now ex-wife or ex-girlfriend. So you're going to be required to follow those conditions. Many jurisdictions combine probation and parole officers because they do very similar things. Parolees have a control contract. They're going to set out an agreement. You're going to sign this that says you're going to obey. This is also going to be signing away certain rights. You're not going to have the full rights of a regular citizen. So you're going to have to, you can't go up to a regular citizen and say, I think you might be doing drugs. I want a drug sample. You can't go up to a regular citizen and say, I think you might have drugs in your house. Let me in. I want to look. Go get a warrant. Right? That's what you have to do. But if you've got someone on probation or parole, you can go to their home and you can go in. So property crimes are the most common reason we see a revocation of parole, usually theft. Parole revocation is very similar to probation revocation. So you're going to see, a preliminary hearing, you're going to see the presentation of evidence, you're going to see whether or not the parole is going to be revoked. States with indeterminate sentencing usually have a system of discretionary release. Now, North Carolina, pretty much, you're going to have a determinate sentence. Parole, remember this, is not a right, but is a privilege. So there's a lot less kind of supervision by the courts of it. In most states, a prisoner is eligible to consider after serving some minimum percentage of a sentence. It might be 75%, it might be 80%. And of course you do have offenders who are serving life sentences who are never eligible for parole. So we do have life without parole. And even sometimes when you're eligible, I'm going to assure you, you never get it. So we had, for example, Charles Manson, who was a real lunatic who was involved in the murders out in California in the 1960s. And to give you an idea what a nut he was, he carved a big swastika in his head and inked it in. So, then went before a parole board. Probably not a wise idea. Was he ever going to get out? No. Did he go before a parole board all the time? Yeah, every few years he went before one. Some of the people involved in the Manson family did finally get out on parole. But even if your sentence says it's not for life, sometimes it quite definitely is. We're never letting you out. Okay, jurisdictions have their own procedures for determining parole. Sometimes you can have a parole board, which is going to make a decision who gets out and who doesn't. And they're going to decide, of course, if a violation occurs, should you be revoked? And the parole board can be as much or as little involved in the whole decision as that state decides it wants to do it. Now, federally, I will say this, there's no federal parole anymore. That's gone. You get a day-for-day sentence federally. So what's the condition? Was your offense? The more minor the offense, the less violent the offense, the more likely you're going to get out. What's your prior record level like? What's your prior criminal record? Did you commit a lot of crimes in the past? You're less likely to get parole. Is it your first offense? You're more likely to get it. What's your attitude towards the victim and the victim's family? What's your mental, physical, and emotional health? So when I was practicing law back in the 1980s, before we developed the cocktail that treated AIDS, we let people out on compassionate release because of their physical health. They were dying in central prison. What's been the offender's behavior behind bars? Did they complete their GED? Did they get training? Did they exhibit remorse? And of course, we'll often look at the wants and the needs of the victims. What do they feel? Have they decided that enough is enough, or do they really feel that incarceration is still warranted? You're going to have a parole hearing. It can be denied. Usually it's prison behavior or severity. Many states have moved away from discretionary guidelines, and you're going to have your, kind of like North Carolina, where you're going to have your max and your minimum served. And the kind of parole board that existed 30, 40 years ago is really dead or dying. Now, many feel that imprisonment don't really reflect how complex crime is. So there are other things we can look at. There are fines, community service, restitution, forfeiture, pretrial diversion. So quickly one at a time. Fines is kind of self-explanatory. Community service, again, kind of self-explanatory. I assume you've heard that. Picking up trash on the highways, classic example. Restitution, if you harmed a victim, one of the things, if I had a client who had done something, one of the things that was very frequently asked by the judge was, did your client make restitution to the victim? If they could. And if they did, it really weighed heavily in his favor. Forfeiture, did you use a boat or a car in the commission of the crime? Often you'll see that car, that boat is forfeited to the state. And pretrial diversion, this is something you see very often for juveniles. We don't want to saddle someone very young with a criminal record, so sometimes we will divert it out of the formal system. This is, again, pretrial diversion is most often for juveniles, where you're going to agree to some special treatment or counseling, and in return for that, the charges will be suspended or withdrawn. Now, problem-solving courts deal with things like drug addiction, mental illness, domestic violence. We're also seeing increasingly interesting, and kind of related to this, is veterans courts, where we are trying to deal with people who've come back from very difficult 20-year wars we fought with PTSD and issues like that. We really seek alternatives there. Forfeiture, this is just a massive thing now, where the government is seizing property it believes is engaged in crime. And sometimes you don't even have to be convicted. Again, this is one of those things that, if we had more time, that we could spend an entire class on talking about forfeiture. But something that's pretty common, billions of dollars being seized every year. Day reporting centers are pretty common, where you have offenders report for treatment or education or sometimes incapacitation. We can have more intensive probation if we feel it's necessary, more frequent surveillance, and the goal here is to give them a little bit more prison-like control over them than otherwise. If there's some reason you couldn't incarcerate someone, maybe it was a physical reason, your jail couldn't handle someone, perhaps some physical illness, you still might want to put very significant restrictions on them if they were violent, for example. Shock incarceration goes back to that sort of thing I talked about earlier, where you get the positive benefits. Boot camp was used, and I'm going to make a quick diversion to boot camp. That was a very popular idea. It turned out not to be terribly effective, but the idea was, and we did studies on this, and at first it seemed somewhat promising, put people through a military-style boot camp. Boot camp builds character. Boot camp will transform a civilian into a soldier, and a soldier is prepared to place himself between society and danger. Good idea. Didn't ultimately work too well. Home confinement, something I'm sure you've all heard of, where we keep people in their homes for extended period of time. And often we do this using the next thing, electronic monitoring, where we have some sort of bracelet or couplet on you that really lets us know where you are, or calls. And there are different levels of home monitoring. It can be detention, incarceration, and there can be programmed contact or continuous signaling, where you wear something that tells us where you are, or where you have to be within a set distance of a phone that's going to call, and if you don't, you violated probation. One of the last points here is widening the net. This is something I've talked about a few times in this class. Widening the net is one of the criticisms of these intermediate sanctions. If you had to spend, remember, there's millions of people on probation and hundreds of thousands of people on parole. If you had to take all those people and put them in prison, that is billions and billions of dollars extra to spend. But since you've got probation, you can put them on probation. So what it allows society to do is to make more things punishable under the criminal law. So it increases the power of the government to intervene. And technology has actually accelerated this. Now there's something else here which is a little bit uglier. One of the things for many states, not North Carolina classically, is if you're convicted of a felony or a serious crime, not just while you're on probation, but afterwards, you can't vote. You can't hold political office sometimes. So by having more crimes that are punishable by things that don't even involve incarceration anymore, you can restrict the franchise. You can change the structure of the power of the government. So there's some interesting questions whether it makes the net wider or gives the government too much power. Okay, that's our lecture. We'll pick up with lecture 11, I believe, next time. Other than that,